Good morning to the people not from the Philippines, and good evening for the people from the Philippines. So today with me is our two good speakers of their sides. You'll see Benjamin Maisonet from Patas Weekly and Sir Erick Hernandez of XB Ministries, Texas Baptist Ministries. He's the lead apologist there. But anyways, I'll let them introduce themselves um, for a short while. Right. So tonight our topic is the belief in God supported by reason. I think this is a very good topic and very intriguing for most Filipino atheists, also Filipino apologists, Christians. I've noticed for the past few lives that we had when we have topics like this, you guys get a lot of viewers. So, anong patupik-tupik pa? Simulan na natin. Right. With me first is Sir Erick Hernandez. He's a Christian, he's a theist, and he's going to defend the affirmative side, the yes answer that to the is the belief in God supported by reason. Right. So to those who doesn't know Sir Erick Hernandez, maybe you get to know him more when he introduces himself. Oh, I think I lost. Okay. Sir Erick, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. And this is this part of our 15 minutes or separate?
Separate.
Okay. Yeah. My name is Erick Hernandez. Like you said, I'm the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and YouTube channel. You could just type my name in our youtube.com/c/Erick Hernandez.
Right. And next is Benjamin Maisonet. Benjamin, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. My name is Benjamin Maisonet, as you can see on the screen. I'm from Patas Weekly. I like gaming and I like composing. That's my short version. I've been an atheist for 10 years and happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. All right. So, some of you might know them. Benjamin from Patas, and I met him in Patas Forum, and of course, Erick, I met him online a few years back. All right. So, before we start, let me get the timer. Again, today's format is first round at 15 minutes opening speech, and to be followed by an open discussion. Basically, it's a moderated open discussion, and they will talk about their plans openly. No restriction for each speech. So you get the gist. Right, so here, wait a second. Okay, so basically, Erick will go first since he's affirmative side. He's going to talk about why why does he believe that there are reasons to and the belief in God is backed up by reason. I'm sorry guys, trying my best. All right, so yun. But niya ano ang rason niya, but naniniwala siyang rason sa or paniniwala niya sa Panginoon. Okay, so let's give him 15 minutes. Listen carefully, and you can send your questions afterwards. All right. Okay, let's do it.
Hold on, let me get my setup here real fast. Open. Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
All right. So the topic of the debate is belief in God supported by reason. Now, not only do I give a resounding yes to that question, but I want to push it a step further and say that for the very possibility or the proper cognitive faculties, capacities, and abilities for the very possibility of reason to exist in the first place, a few factors must be in place, which either cannot or would not be the case or arise if atheism were true. Now, by atheism, I mean simply the position that God does not exist. I know that Benjamin has a different definition, but just the sake of the way I'm using it for clarity, I'm going to be taking a backdoor approach and basically saying that if there is no God, then these things would follow, and these things would not give even the possibility for reason or rationality to even exist or in principle be possible in the first place. These would be things like cognitive faculties that are designed and aimed at truth, consciousness, and libertarian free will. Now, the first argument I want to give is known usually as Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, or sometimes called the argument from reason. And to give a quick illustration of the way this argument works is, suppose you wake up one day, you're taking a nap, and you wake up, and you notice that it's very hot in the room, and you wake up and you see that you look at the microwave, and you see that the microwave says 12 o'clock. Then you also feel that it's very hot in the room. There's actually water under the fridge. And you notice actually that the microwave is blinking 12 o'clock. Now, from this, you form the belief that the power went out. And while the microwave may say 12 o'clock, you actually don't know whether or not it's 12 o'clock. In other words, even though you form the belief it's 12 o'clock by looking at the microwave, you also know that your belief that it is 12 o'clock is based on the reading of the microwave, which, given that the power went out, it now poses an undercutting defeater for rationally holding to the belief it is 12 o'clock, given that the microwave, which is based on the power went out. So you now have a reason to not believe or distrust the belief that it is 12 o'clock. And suppose you want to say, okay, but I could maybe check my room and look at the alarm clock and see what time it says. Well, it's going to do the same thing because it's all connected to the power. So any belief that you form on the basis of the microwave for what time it is going to carry with it an undercutting defeater. Now, in the same way, if God did not exist, let's first say that when we look at the way human beings came into existence, we see that there was a process of naturalistic evolution, which was driven by the mechanism of natural selection. Now, what's important to understand here is that natural selection is going to be something that is going to aim at survival value and not necessarily truth value. The reason I say that is that our brains are nothing more than like our nails, our teeth. This was given to us by natural selection. Again, these things are going to be aimed at survival value, not necessarily truth value. To give an example of why this is a problem here, how it relates to the microwave, suppose there is a car coming towards me. I form the belief that there's a car coming towards me, and if I don't move out of the way, it's going to kill me. So based on that belief, I jump out of the way and I survive. Now, given natural selection, if our beliefs are going to be passed on, or our brain states are going to be passed on, and if our beliefs are what cause our actions, then the point of natural selection is going to be aimed at passing on behaviors and selecting for behaviors that grant survival value, not necessarily truth value. Take the same illustration, and suppose, again, a car's coming towards me, but I form the belief there's a car coming towards me. I also have the belief that I am Superman, and if it hits me, it's not going to kill me. However, I want to preserve my identity as Clark Kent, and I don't want people to know I'm Superman. So I jump out of the way of the car, and so that way people think I'm still human and I'm not Superman. And the point is, although that belief was false, it still granted survival value. And the only thing natural selection is concerned about, and I'm personifying here, is that our beliefs form and give us behaviors that are adapted for survival and not necessarily truth. In other words, if there is no God and your brain was not designed with cognitive faculties as a mechanism designed to obtain truth, it really doesn't matter whether or not your beliefs are true. The only thing that matters is that your beliefs give us adaptive survival. So, in other words, if that's the case, then we now have an undercutting defeater for any belief our brain produces. Just like the reading of the microwave, if any belief that you form, even concerning what time it is, now has an undercutting defeater because the power went out, so it affects any belief formed on the basis of the microwave. In the same sense, if there is no God, you now have an undercutting defeater for any belief that your brain produces, including the belief there is no God. Now, to push it a step even further, in order for knowledge to even be possible in the first place, you have to have at bare minimum something like a justified true belief. Now, in order to have a rational justification for anything, you need to have cognitive faculties that are reliable, that you can trust, that are aimed at truth. However, if given natural selection, and given Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, it then becomes a case that if you cannot rationally justify anything, because everything now has an undercut and defeater, then it follows that you can't have knowledge. We could actually say that if atheism were true, that is the position there is no God. If there is no God, if that's true, then we cannot have rationality. But if we cannot have rationality, we cannot have knowledge. However, if we do have knowledge, then it follows that atheism cannot be true. Moreover, when we push it a step further, now let's say how Benjamin is able to overcome that. I don't think he can, but let's say he can. Nevertheless, you would still need something like libertarian free will. Why is that? Because you'd have to be able to rationally be free to examine the evidence and not be causally determined to believe the things that you do. Let me explain how this is a problem. Again, given the way we came to exist, if there is no God, you have a process of physical pieces of matter rearranging themselves into more complicated pieces of matter. Now, if this is the case, then the most logically consistent position for an atheist to take for the nature of human beings would be a position known as physicalism, which is a view that the only thing that exists concerning human beings are physical properties and parts. There are no material things. There's nothing like a soul. There's nothing, there's no God. There's no material supernatural kind of entities like spirits or nothing like that. Why is this a problem? Well, if there is no God, then it would also be the case that the law of causal closure is true. According to the law of causal closure, every physical event must necessarily have a physical cause. Well, here's why it's a problem. Aristotle used the illustration that if I move a rock with my staff, it is my staff that moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, what moved me? Now, the way I define libertarian free will is that you are the first mover of your will or actions. That is to say, you are not causally determined by external factors beyond your control. If I raise my hand and there was nothing that caused me to do it, I'd say you have libertarian free will. However, if I tased you and you raised your hand, and that's what caused you to raise your hand, then you were not a first mover, but rather an intermediate mover in a chain of events. So, with this in mind, and the law of causal closure in mind, suppose a non-believer wants to say, okay, well, I can explain what moved my hand by pointing to neurons firing in my brain. That's all fine and dandy. However, if the law of causal closure is true, then you're going to have to ask the question that given your neurons firing was a physical event, the question would still arise, and what caused that neuron fire to fire? Well, in causal closure, it must be a prior physical event. At this point is where the physicalist would have a problem, because now you have basically two options, which will not lead to any type of return free will. You could first say, well, another neuron fired in order to fire the first neuron, and that's what caused my hand to move and so forth. Then that only pushes back the goalpost, and the problem still arises. And eventually you'll get into an infinite regress in which the hand will never move to move the staff to move the rock. Obviously, if the action did occur, then you can't say at some point you're going to have to stop positing neurons firing. And at some point you're going to have to point at something that is external to yourself, that came prior to you, that was a physical event that caused your neuron to fire, that caused the hand to move, that caused the staff to move, that caused the rock to move. But then you're no longer, again, an intermediate mover. You're now a secondary mover, and that would do away with libertarian free will. Now, suppose non-believer wants to say, well, I don't believe in libertarian free will. Oh, if libertarian free will doesn't exist, you're going to also have to give up other things, namely intellectual integrity and moral responsibility. Why is that the case? Well, because if, put it this way, suppose that Benjamin is going to say, and which, we likely will, is that he came to his beliefs by freely looking at the evidence and coming to his own conclusion. Well, if there is no something like a soul that would be transcendent to the physical, then every belief that he has had was causally determined by external factors beyond his control, which means that he literally could not have been intellectually responsible for any of the thoughts or beliefs which he currently possesses, including, of course, the belief or his lack of belief that there is no God. And his very decision to become an atheist was not something that he freely did on the basis of rational intellectual reasons, Rather was merely something that he was determined to do and believe, and he could not have done otherwise. Hence, his very decision to be an atheist was literally a non-rational, non-intellectual decision that he was causally determined to make by factors beyond his control. The same would apply to moral responsibility, but I'll just kind of pass on that for now. Thirdly, the third argument I'd like to make would be that for rationality or reason to even be possible, then consciousness would have to exist. But consider this, is that it would be safe to say that if there is no God, and given physicalism, then we are brought about by just natural processes, which is just physical stuff interacting with physical stuff. And I would assume that Benjamin does not believe in anything like a soul. Then what you're going to have to do with something like consciousness is that you're going to have to reduce it or make it identical to something physical like the brain. However, Leibniz's law of identity shows us that when two things are in question, if the mind is reducible or nothing more than the brain, then whatever is true of the mind must be true of the brain and vice versa. It's like saying water and H2O. I'm just using two different names to refer to the same thing. Well, if that's the case with consciousness, then if there is no God, consciousness is going to have to be something physical. But again, based on Leibniz's law of identity, we know that that's not the case. Because if I can find something true of the mind that's not true of the brain and vice versa, then they're not the same thing and they can't be reduced to each other. So here's just 3 examples. Take the states of my mind versus the states of my brain. A state of consciousness is something like a thought or belief. My thoughts or beliefs can be true or false. It makes no sense to say that my neuron that's firing on the right hemisphere of my brain is true or false. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the belief that I'm talking to you guys right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. My brain can be in a state where it's 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana is not 7 inches long. I can give a lot more examples, but I think the point simply follows that if all the properties of the brain are physical and all the properties of the mind are not physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it cannot be physical. However, if what we've discussed so far, naturalistic evolution and physicalism, it would be safe to say that if there is no God, then consciousness should be physical. If consciousness is not physical, and on the atheistic there is no God belief position, in physicalism, consciousness should not exist. We could make the argument that if there is no God, then consciousness should not exist. Consciousness does exist, therefore there is a God. Moreover, again, if consciousness cannot exist, given that consciousness is not physical, given that on a non-belief in God position, consciousness wouldn't exist, then not only can you not have reason based on my first argument, not only are you free to be rational or reasonable based on my second argument, these things cannot even be possible in the first place because there would be no consciousness, given that everything that exists would be reducible or identical to something physical. So in summation, I'd say that if Benjamin has put any trust in his rational abilities in any sense, and if he wants us to believe that he freely came to a lack of belief in God or rejecting a belief in God on the basis of freely analyzing the data and following the evidence freely where it leads and freely coming to his own rational and reasonable conclusion, and if he believes this, which is a conscious state, then the position that there is no God cannot be true, and it would also show that reason is possible. But if there is no God, you cannot have reason, you cannot have rational cognitive faculties that are aimed at truth, it cannot exist, and consciousness would not exist either, given that it would have to be reducible to something like a brain. So is belief in God supported by reason? Yes, it is. And not only that, if there were no God, reason would literally metaphysically be impossible.
Right, I think that's the first speech, or the opening speech for Erick. Now let's prepare ourselves for Benjamin. All right, Benjamin, whenever you're ready, I'll start your timer.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I'm just going to start off by thanking Zuriel for Diskurso Pinas putting this on. This is a great it's a great little discussion that we can have, and Erick for coming here and taking the time to speak with me. I'm pretty much a nobody in this circle. I don't have a dog in this fight yet. I'm new, so I appreciate him taking the time to speak to me. I thank you very much. And we actually had some nice conversation before today, so it was very pleasant. And Erick's a really cool guy, and I'm happy to be having this conversation. So I'm just going to start with my opening, and I'm just going to start with if you believe in God, I'm mostly speaking to you and not to those who already agree with me necessarily. I am here to hopefully try to give an understanding as to why someone who was a Christian until his early 20s, preaching to his friends in small college groups, playing in the church orchestra, played the tuba for years, how you go from that kind of person to becoming a non-believer. And while it's not my goal to necessarily change anyone's mind, I do hope that I, as an atheist, can maybe give you some insight as to what goes on in my mind and give a defense as to why I don't believe in a way that hopefully most people will understand. The topic of today's discussion is belief in God supported by reason? This question needs to be parsed out a little bit, so I'm going to break it down to the easy bits, and then we'll work our way to the more complicated stuff. So firstly, we'll start with belief. I think that's an easy one. Belief is simply something that you hold to be true. Beliefs don't necessarily require good reasons. You can believe things for good reasons and bad reasons. But it must be stated that you can't choose your beliefs in any simple sense. Beliefs are a brain state where you are convinced that something is true, and you can't actively convince yourself that something is true. Some people believe things easier than others. I myself have a very high bar for what is allowed in as a belief. I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. When it comes to this God question, I don't believe that a God exists, but I do not believe that the God doesn't exist. To not believe something is not the same as believing that it is not. Erick gave a definition of atheism, which is, I'm not going to fight him on that. I don't agree with the definition, but I'm more concerned with the concepts, and this is something we had already talked about. So let's talk about this God label for a moment. What is a God? How can you define a God? Well, I won't be defining a God tonight because it's not really my job to do that. The onus to define something is on the person asserting that this something exists. Defining a God will be the job of Erick. Erick gave a definition to me before the debate, and I think he might have mentioned it in his opening. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I heard him say disembodied mind or not, but that was the definition he gave me. And he also said the God of classical theism, the omni-God, all-knowing, all-powerful, etc. So what I will say is that most gods are very ill-defined. Even the definition that Erick provides, a disembodied mind, well, all minds that I have any knowledge of occur in physical bodies, and we have no evidence that such a thing can possibly exist absent a body. This God of classical theism, the omni-God, but of course I think that would be all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, but that which is not logically contradictory. I'm sure Erick will correct me on that if I'm mistaken. God can't make a burrito so hot that he can't eat it. I'd be fine with any definition of God that follows along these lines or similar. Anything else would make me question why we're calling it a God, for instance. This coffee cup. If you said that this coffee cup is God, I would wonder why you're calling it that, because we already have a label for it, and that's coffee cup. There's really no reason to apply this unusual label, this term that doesn't make any sense to that. So why don't I believe in this thing? Well, this brings me to reason. Reason is the mechanism by which we attempt to draw inferences in logic. And what this means is that you can't simply give some reason you believe in a God. That would be an equivocation fallacy that fails to answer the question of today's discussion. Instead, we're talking about reason as in the philosophical definition, which is an application of logic. Earlier, I stated that I wanted to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. And I need some mechanism to do that. That mechanism is the application of reason and a reliance on evidence-based analysis of the world around me. So how do we use reason, and what is it exactly? Well, reason is based on the laws of logic, of which there are 3 absolute laws of logic that apply to everything. The law of identity, for instance, this apple is an apple. The law of non-contradiction, the apple is also not an apple. And the law of excluded middle, the apple cannot be neither or both at the same time. It must either be an apple or not an apple. These logical absolutes are true whether we're here or not, whether anything exists or not, and they are an essence of any reality. Reality is reality and is not reality, and it's not neither or both at the same time. From these logical absolutes, we can derive certain truths that can be discovered using logic. When it comes to propositional logic, you have premises and conclusions. Aristotle and company went through all of the various forms of a propositional argument can take and determine that of the 256 possible forms, 24 of them form valid structures. Per this, we also determine that if your structure doesn't fall into one of these 24 specific structures, then your conclusion is based on what we call a logical fallacy. Discovering a logical fallacy in a premise doesn't mean that your conclusion is false. It just means that the truth value of your conclusion cannot be determined from that syllogism. And when it comes to propositional logic, the true premises lead to true conclusions. Or more accurately, if you accept that the premises are true, you must either accept the conclusion or you are simply being irrational. I realize that this can be confusing for some who are just being introduced to it, but suffice to say, logic forms the foundation of reason, and reason forms the basis for rational discussion. If you divorce yourself from either logic or reason, you have divorced yourself from having any rational conversation. So let's bring this all the way around. Per the God question, why don't I believe? Well, because the God has never been demonstrated to exist, and every propositional logical argument that has ever been presented has failed with one logical fallacy or another. But that's not all. What if someone does come up with a valid structured argument? Does that mean I would suddenly believe in a God? Well, not necessarily, because it could be the case that the argument has a false premise that I can't currently identify, or a premise that hasn't been demonstrated. In logic, we call this a bare assertion. For example, premise 1, if humans exist, a God exists. Premise 2, humans exist. Conclusion, therefore God exists. The structure of the argument is fine. There is no fallacy there. How do I know? Because it is one of the 24 valid forms. Fx, then y. Premise 2, x. Conclusion, therefore y. An example of an argument Eric and I would probably disagree or agree is not valid would be if the Earth exists, then magic Earth-producing fairies exists. The Earth exists, therefore magic Earth-producing fairies exists. The problem is not a fallacy of structure, but rather the argument is unsound. This is a contingency argument. If X exists, then Y necessarily exists. I think Eric alluded to that a couple of times. But how do we know that this statement is true? How can we determine that a God actually exists in reality? You have to demonstrate this contingency by demonstrating each premise in actuality. A logical argument has two properties that must both be met. Validity, which determines if the structure is valid, one of those 24 possible valid ones, and soundness, which addresses the content of the argument. If the argument is valid, then you must also check if it is sound, as in, does the content map to reality in a demonstrable way? It is not enough to simply rely on valid arguments to demonstrate a God exists. You must step outside of the argument into reality and offer an evidence-based demonstration for each premise of an argument. This is the problem that I have with all philosophical arguments for the existence of God, And when arguing with apologists or theologians in particular, I find that they don't seem to understand the importance of soundness and how it's required before a syllogism is to be believed. You have to provide empirical evidence and data to demonstrate the soundness of any argument. Note that it is not my job in this discussion to disprove a God or demonstrate gods don't exist. I am simply here to offer the necessity of applying logic, reason, and evidence to propositions and respond to Erick's claims. It is Erick who carries that burden of proof. A burden of proof in logic simply means that you are the one making the claim, i.e. God exists, and so it is your responsibility to demonstrate that that claim is actually true. I am justified by reason in rejecting that claim until you've met your burden. Failing to provide actual evidence and argument, not simply one or the other, means you aren't seriously addressing the question of tonight's discussion and aren't engaged in reason, and so far no one has ever met the burden of proof to demonstrating a God exists sufficient for me to believe, and so I, to answer the question of tonight's discussion, is belief in God supported by reason, give a resounding no. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. I think you're muted, Zuriel. Yeah, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that. Yeah, I think that was quick. Benjamin just around 9 minutes or so. Yeah, where do we want to start now? It's an open discussion. We can start. Where would you want to start?
Well, yeah, we could just have some back and forth.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I actually wanted to start with God is necessary for reason is a claim that you made. Is that right, Erick? Yes? Okay. How do you know that?
Based on the three arguments I gave.
Okay. So from what I'm
your response to those arguments, actually.
No, I'm sure we'll get to that. That might take a little while. I kind of wanted to start at the top and work my way through. So I'm curious: is when you say God is necessary for reason, is that a beginning premise or is that a conclusion? Like if you had to give it a...
It could. Let's go back to what I did say in that. So first of all, when we start at the beginning, we see that given naturalistic evolution, your brain would not be a mechanism designed to obtain truth. Would you agree with that?
I think so, but that's not really quite answering my question that I was asking. So
in other words, that would probably be the premise of the first argument.
Okay. Well, what I was asking, Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's a conclusion. I'm sorry, there might be lag. That's my fault. It would be the conclusion, I guess, to answer your question directly.
Okay. Yeah, I was trying to figure out, is that the conclusion or the premise? So I'm fine with that then. So we can come back to that. So you're using these three arguments as a precursor to the conclusion, God is necessary for reason. Is that right?
I think each argument would stand independently. Each one of those arguments would lead to that conclusion. It would be either a direct conclusion or an implication of the conclusion.
Okay.
So I'm taking so you talked about logic. I'm using propositional logic and taking the propositional logic of modus tollens, where in formal logic, you're going to say if P then Q, P therefore Q, but it's also valid to say if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So
Yes.
I'm taking a backdoor approach, saying if there is no God, X would follow. X is not true, therefore the position there is no God is not true. So it's a double negation, which would mean that therefore there is a God. An implication of that would be that without these things, you can't have reason or rationality.
So I do want to break these arguments down one at a time. Perhaps we can do that. But I think the first thing I want to harken back to is this validity versus soundness issue that I have. And this is going to be like the crux of our disagreement, I think. Because for me, it's like, it doesn't really matter to me how many arguments you throw at me, even if they're valid structures, because unless you step outside of the argument and show me empirical, tangible data, all I'm going on is there's some valid structure here, because I can formulate arguments that have valid structures and are false because we know they're false because of evidence in reality. I can just give one quick example if you want, but
well, yeah. Well, if you want to give the example, it's fine. I'll just hold my.
I was going to do it. I was going to do it for the audience because I figured you probably already agree with that. But if you don't, then
I guess to comment on that. Well, a few things. First, I'd say there's a difference between a valid argument that leads to a argument could be valid, but you could disagree with some of the premises, which would mean that it's kind of like what you're saying, that it's not true based on other evidences. But I find it a bit odd that you're basically saying you can't just give an argument, and yet your entire opening statement was exactly that, just argument. So based on your own criteria, you haven't provided any evidence for anything you said.
I would disagree with that, and the reason I would disagree is because I wasn't attempting to make a positive claim. I was responding to a positive claim.
Nevertheless, you're giving arguments, right?
I guess you can think of it that way. I wasn't able to. We actually had this conversation a little bit. I wasn't able to formulate it into premises and conclusions beforehand, so I didn't have a chance to do that. But I guess you could argue that I am making an argument. I probably could provide evidence for it, and the evidence for me would be that there is a lack of evidence for your claim, because that's what the argument is doing. It's responding to your claims, to your arguments.
Well, a few things is I think arguments is a form of evidence. Logic is a form of evidence. I don't think you need to empirically verify everything, because that itself, to have the thought that you need to empirically verify everything is itself not empirically verifiable. So you're starting off your entire premise with a logical fallacy, which by default cannot lead to a true conclusion.
Okay.
And I the burden of proof is something, and like you say, we did talk about this beforehand, and I appreciate the discussion, and we had a great talk. But what you're saying is, like we had in our discussion, any belief that you hold, be it a negation or affirmation of a belief, you still bear a burden of proof to provide evidence for why you believe or do not believe something. I don't think that I lack evidence.
I don't think so. I would disagree with that.
Okay, well that's fine. Okay, that's fine. Let me finish my thought here,
Sure.
and then I'll let you push back. So, no, it's fine. So, saying that your evidence is that I lack evidence, I think that's evidence for you, because consider this, and then I'll give you the floor. I have no evidence that there's a flea in this room. And I conclude that therefore there is no flea. No, at best I can be agnostic, but that's not evidence for agnosticism. Agnosticism doesn't necessarily require evidence for, kind of like what I think you're alluding to. But that's, in other words, there could be a flea in this room, and I just lack evidence, but that doesn't mean that therefore there is no flea. And I know that's not what you're saying, but that's a point to show that that's not evidence for a lack position. Now, the topic of the debate is belief in God supported by reason. If you say no, then I would say that you have to bear a burden to provide why that is not the case. Why is belief in God not supported by reason? And what you gave were arguments, may have implied that. If you're going to say you can't just give arguments, you need to step outside and give empirical evidence. You didn't give any, so that's why I'll just reiterate, based on your own criteria, you haven't given any evidence so far.
Right. So what I would say to that is that, and thank you, is that no, I don't have to provide evidence, because I'm not saying that there is a belief that no God exists, that we can say gods don't exist, that there is no flea in the room, which I think you kind of said correctly. But what I would very much clearly want to state and illustrate here is that when I'm responding to an argument with an argument, I'm saying, I do not believe this argument, and here's why. Here's my reasons why I don't agree with this argument. I don't have to provide evidence why I don't agree. I just have to say that I think this is incorrect, I think this is incorrect, I think this is incorrect, and then it's your job to demonstrate that I'm incorrect, that those are incorrect, demonstrate that those are in fact correct. So, and this, the proof of this, or the demonstration of this, would be, for example, would you agree with this? All X are Y, all Y are Z, therefore all X are Z. Yes, me too. That is a valid structure argument. So let's fill in those X, Y, Zs. All planets are made of iron. All items made of iron are wormholes, therefore all planets are wormholes. Do you agree with that? Okay. And the reason I would think you don't agree with it is because it's demonstrably false in reality. Yes? Okay. So my point there would be, this is the whole point of soundness. You have to demonstrate that a premise is true in actuality, in reality, with empirical evidence. You can't, and this is, every premise has to be demonstrated. The conclusion doesn't, because the conclusion follows from the premises. But each premise, all planets are made of iron and all items made of iron are wormholes, would both have to be demonstrated to be true before you can believe, or before it's rational to believe the conclusion. So even a valid structure doesn't get you there.
So you're still appealing to empiricism, which, as I said, is a self-refuting position.
Why is it self-refuting?
Because to say, well, if you're going to say that everything needs to be demonstrated empirically, then that very claim itself cannot be demonstrated empirically.
Yeah, I would disagree with that, because I'm presupposing empiricism. And things that are presupposed are not to be. Well, you could say that. I'm presupposing the validity of logic and reason. I'm presupposing that reason is reasonable. Would you disagree that reason is reasonable?
Well, it's a tautology, so yeah, tautologies are true by default. X is necessarily true.
Sure, and reason...
That doesn't kind of push the conversation further.
Right, and reason intrinsically includes requiring soundness in an argument. Soundness being required empirical evidence. So I presuppose, you could say, there's like a chain of things that I presuppose that kind of fall together, which is, I presuppose the logical absolutes, I presuppose that reason is reasonable, therefore I also presuppose empiricism is required to believe a logical argument.
And I guess I'll just... talking to an atheist presuppositionalist, which is fine. Which you kind of conceded, I guess. You can. In
a way,
so
I guess.
Let me ask the question. fascinating. Let me ask a question. So given we obviously disagree on that in empiricism, and I'd like to push back more there, but I also want to kind of move on from there.
Yeah, we can get back around
so
to
you
it.
said that you said beliefs are brain states and that all minds are in physical bodies. Can you demonstrate that?
That's not quite what I said. What I said, all minds that we can identify occur in physical bodies. And as far as beliefs being brain states, that's not my assessment. That's neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm going to try to stay away from too much of that. But my basic understanding of what neuroscientists, I've read Daniel Dennett and others, is that beliefs are brain states.
Well, that's interesting because Dennett isn't a neuroscientist. He's a philosopher of science. So he would be giving arguments, not empirical evidence.
I guess that's
to
true.
Reject as any kind of valid. You'd have to reject what he says.
He cites neuroscience when he talks about consciousness and beliefs. And while he himself may not be a neuroscientist. Sorry, there's a lag.
So what do you do when you have? No, that's fine. So and I appreciate the mutual respect here. So what do you do when you have two neuroscientists who disagree on that? I would say so. Let me just. I'll say this way. I would say that the question of. I would say the question of consciousness and the soul are metaphysical questions involving philosophy, not scientific questions, because science can only go so far. It would be like saying that because my metal detector did not detect plastic on the beach, there's no way I can verify whether or not plastic exists. But if your entire presupposition is that you need metal detectors to detect anything on the beach, including plastic, then sure, you're not going to find plastic if you're using a metal detector. That's what I think you're doing with the empirical claim. But yeah, you said you can answer that real quick. What was your answer there?
Oh, my answer would be I default to what has been peer reviewed. I don't care if some scientist somewhere says he disagrees with the peer review. The peer review is all that matters to me. Peer review is demonstrably the single most consistent, reliable method of determining what is or isn't. I'm going to use the word true loosely in science because science doesn't give us truth, but science gives us tentative conclusions.
So are you saying it's not possible for there to be two peer-reviewed missions that contradict each other?
Oh, sure. And what happens is they have to mutually come to an agreement at some point. Either they come to an agreement that one of them is wrong, and they do more testing to determine which one is wrong or which one is right. The whole purpose of peer review is to try to falsify claims, and peer review is not just instant, approval of whatever someone says. It's review. So it's not something that I could say. I'm not a scientist, so it's not something that I could say I accept all peer review instantly. It's just that the peer review process, this process of experts reviewing other experts' information for flaws and incorrect assumptions, is to it makes it okay for lay people like perhaps you and me, because I don't think you're a scientist either, to accept whatever these claims are to the extent that it's reasonable to accept them. So, and then one more quick thing I want to go back to for just a second, this whole thing about the metal detector. I would say I agree with you that if the metal detector can't detect plastic, that we can't determine there's plastic in the ground, and then let's say the plastic is equivalent to the God or a soul, then it would be up to you, the person claiming there is plastic in the ground, to provide a detector for plastic. It's not up to me to disprove that there's plastic in the ground, and it's certainly not my responsibility to try and prove it correct.
Right, but and that's why I went to the claim that you did make, because, so in other words, I guess to first say, so then you would have to reject the claim you made that reviewed as I don't know exactly how you said it, but basically you're kind of putting all your eggs in the basket of peer reviewed, but then you conceded that peer reviews can contradict each other. So it looks like we need more than that. So when it comes to the quote, quote plastic detector that I would need to demonstrate that. Well, I think logic and logically valid sound arguments are ways of coming to truth, because there is a priori truth and a posteriori truth. And for the listeners who don't know that, a posteriori truth is something you come to after an investigation. a prioritized truth is something you can come to prior to investigation. And these would be things like mathematics. This would be things like logic, tautologies. When you understand the concept of what it means to be a triangle, you never have to go out in the real world and empirically find a triangle to know that by definition, a triangle is 3 points, which must have necessarily 3 sides. And just on the basis of understanding what a triangle is, you can come to knowledge of it without any type of quote empirical investigation. But I do want to continue to push on that. If you're going to say that all minds that you can detect are embodied, my question would be, how do you detect a mind in the first place?
How do we detect a mind? I'm not sure I said that we could detect minds.
Identify.
Identify, yeah. I guess the way I identify a mind is that there's a brain or some medium that is thinking. And the way we identify thinking, I guess, would have to be through, is this thing able to perform cognitive functions? Is it responding to stimuli? That would be the basic. I would start there and then probably work my way up from that. But I think that's at a basic level. Does this thing respond to stimuli? And is it in a physical medium or in some medium? Now, it may be the case that that's setting up a circular argument, so I want to be careful. I don't want to beg the question here that, if we're assessing minds in physical entities, but if it is the case that there is some mind capable of not existing in a physical medium, that to me would need to be shown to me. I wouldn't be able to just accept it on face value alone.
Right, then you can understand my trouble that I'm in the same boat as you. I can't detect that only minds we can identify in physical mediums unless you first tell me how you identify or detect a mind in the first place. If all you're doing is detecting brain states,
well, that's the thing. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't explain it in detail. But I'm sure if you asked Mayim Bialik, she'd be able to tell you. She's from Big Bang Theory. She's a neuroscientist. I actually watched one of her lectures, and it was brilliant. And I'd really recommend going watching her because she's very, very well articulated on this stuff. But yeah, I think
you have.
I have an objection also to something you said about the triangle. The triangle is a definitional thing, so that's something that I would have to disagree is intuitive or anything like that. It's just definitional. A triangle has 3 sides. That's definitional.
Oh, sure, but definitions. So then you would agree then that you can know things without any type of empirical verification. Even if you want to reduce it to saying it's definitional, then you would have to concede that I was right there, right?
Oh, I agree we can know certain things. I'm just saying that we can't know things about reality. In other words, I could say that a triangle is something with 3 sides, but to demonstrate a triangle exists in reality, we would have to step outside of that definition and show it. The definition is an abstract, not a actual.
Well, right, and that's not what my point was. My point is about knowing things. We're talking about knowledge here, knowledge and belief. So you can come to knowledge about.
How do you define knowledge? I'm sorry, I didn't get a knowledge definition from you. I think we might disagree on that definition.
That's fine. Well, I did in the beginning mention it's at least a justified true belief, bare minimum.
Oh, you did? Okay. So I must have misheard it, or maybe it cut out. But so justified true belief, I think I would probably agree with that definition to an extent. I like to think of it as knowledge is just saying I really, really, really believe this to the extent that it would be worldview altering to discover that you were incorrect. If I discovered that in fact none of this in front of me is actually here and all of this is a figment of my imagination, that would certainly impact my worldview significantly, and that's why I consider it knowledge. That I am in fact in a room with a computer and talking to you over the phone or Discord, whatever.
So I do want to stick on the brain mind thing because
we can do that.
So I have talked to neuroscientists, and I did give an argument regarding Leibniz's law of identity, which is a principle in logic, and I think you agreed that we can come to the conclusion of things based on logical deductions. So Leibniz's law of identity, you can see that brain states and mental states are not the same thing. So you cannot reduce the mind to the brain. What would you say to that?
Cannot reduce the mind to the brain. Is that what you just said? It's cutting out on my end just a little bit in my headphones. I'm not sure why, but.
I'll try to talk slower. So you cannot reduce the mind to you cannot reduce the mind to the brain, nor is the mind identical to the brain.
It might be my cable. Oh, we're good. Yeah. I would have to agree that mental states are probably separate from brain states. A mental state is a description. It's an abstraction of a brain state. A brain state is a physical thing. A brain state is like the arrangement of neurons, and then the mental state would be the abstraction of what those that collection of neurons represents in my head. In my attempt to understand reality, I think Carl Sagan is quoted as saying, like the simplest thought, like the concept of the number one, has a labyrinth of logical underbidding, and the brain has its own language for testing the structure and consistency of the world around us, and that is. And that is the best way I can understand what that means. So we have the physical thing, which is the brain and the electrons, or the electrical signals in the neurons. And then we have the abstract, which is the emergent property, the mind that emerges from that, the conscious state that emerges from that, which is the mental state. So those are distinct, but I don't see how that means that it can't only be physical, because the abstraction, the conscious part requires the physical. Without my brain functioning, without the neurons existing, my mental state disappears.
You know that.
How do I know that? We can examine other examples of this. There's plenty of examples of split brain patients and people who've suffered brain injury, and there's.
What would that prove?
I would just go look. It would prove that when you alter the physical medium, you alter the brain state or the mental state. Sorry.
How does it follow that? Therefore.
Oh, I'm not saying it necessarily follows. I'm saying that's all that I can assess. That's my determination, is that I am convinced that is the case. I'm not saying it's absolutely the case.
Well, right, sure, but I'm asking you to provide evidence for why you're convinced of that, not because whether or not you're convinced is, in a sense, well, you said if you alter brain states, and said, I guess then you alter mental states. I would agree with that, but that wouldn't in any way demonstrate that they're the same thing or reducible to one another. I would point to people like Jaegwon Kim, Thomas Nagel, Karl Popper, John Eccles. These are all atheists who would disagree with what you just said.
Yeah, I don't care. I'm not debating them. You're debating me.
Right. Well, right. That's my point. Well, you brought up Danner Dennett, right? I mean, in other words, because you're going to point to peer-reviewed, I can point to people who write peer-reviewed stuff who disagree with what you're saying. So there, obviously, one of us is wrong. Now, if you're going to say that things are in your head or in your brain, when you think of a pink elephant, how big is that pink elephant in your brain?
It's not. There's no size. It doesn't have a size.
Okay. So then if it is, where is it at?
It's not anywhere. There is no pink elephant.
When you think of a pink elephant, it's in your mind?
Yeah, there's no pink elephant in my mind. There's an abstraction of a pink elephant in my mind. I guess maybe an example that might be easier for me to grasp, because I do this all the time, is chess. Would you agree that and I think we would, that there's a distinction between the game that is being played and the actual pieces?
Game that is being played in the actual pieces. Well, I think they would go hand in hand.
Right, one depends on the other, but at the same time, I can imagine the pieces moving and have a chess game with you. I could say, I just moved my queen to e4, and you can move in your head, you can abstract moving your queen to e4, whether or not there's a physical board in this case. And so it's not a perfect analogy, but my point would be, every analogy breaks down at some point, but my point would be that if we say that the game is dependent on the board, right, just for the sake of argument, if I move the pieces, the game has changed. The game state
Now this
has
is
changed.
really fast. This is really fascinating because it seems like you're saying that there can exist a game of chess without a chessboard or pieces, yet you're not going to say that there can exist a mind without the brain.
Because I'm making an analogy, and no analogy is going to be perfect because we're talking about something cognitive already. The idea of the chess game is itself a cognitive thing. So I'm doing my best to illustrate that, for the sake of argument, that the chess game is distinct from the chess pieces. I don't think there's going to be a perfect analogy for this, but that's the best I can do.
No, I understand, but I guess what I'm saying is, in principle, you are conceding that when you can differentiate something, it could actually be separate from its physical representation.
Yeah, I would say like the elephant in my brain is separate from the actual elephant in reality. It's distinct. But what I would also say is that my abstraction changes when the physical medium changes, which is what I was getting at with the chessboard. That was my point about the chessboard. When we change the game,
right, and
pieces,
I would definitely
we change
agree
the actual game. Go ahead. I'll shut up now. Your turn.
And what does that demonstrate?
I was trying to illustrate. I was trying to illustrate that the physical changes the mental. I'm doing my best to illustrate it. I may not have a perfect analogy for that on the fly. Unfortunately, I haven't really prepared for this part of the conversation.
I don't disagree with that. So I guess I'm asking why do you think that was a point to make, or do you think that was a point to make in contrast to my position?
I was trying to get you to understand, and maybe we won't agree on this, and that's fine too. But I was just trying to get you to understand my position, which is that if you alter my brain in any way, you will in some way alter my mental state. You will alter my ability to abstract things. So that's something that we can do on purpose. We can deliberately change people's brains. We can cut out half of their brain if part of it's damaged. We can do lobotomies and change people's behavior. We can do electrical. What the hell is it called? I can't remember what it's called, but they used to do it. It's cruel. I wouldn't recommend anybody doing it now. But it's when they change people's schizophrenia by electrocuting them with electrical signals. So I mean, we can change people's brain states and change their mental states. So to me, it demonstrates to the best degree of certainty that I can accept that one is dependent on the other. That you necessarily have to have one for the other.
That wouldn't necessarily show dependence. That would show correlation. But I guess my original question though was still, I mean, do you think that's a counterpoint to my position? Do you think, because I would agree with you, so I don't know what you would be getting. I guess
it seemed like what you were
was your
saying.
conclusion that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I guess that was your conclusion. What you said at the end was that there's a correlation there, but I agree with you. There's a correlation, and we look at things like
I would
cognitive
say
behavioral
there's
therapy.
also a causation. That's what I would say. I would say there's a causation as well.
Right.
Okay.
But causation is not the same thing as dependence.
Well, okay. So my point, I guess, that we maybe don't disagree on is that one causes the other. And that to me is convincing enough for me that one is dependent on the other. And until someone shows me that the other, that is not, until you can show me that you can falsify this, you can attempt to falsify it by proving that, or demonstrating that the soul can be altered, or that there is a soul that can, persist absent a brain.
Remember earlier in your opening, you talked about logical fallacies and how reason is used. I think you just made one in saying, well, because there's correlation, that therefore convinces me it's dependent. Well, that's not an argument. That's just a claim that you haven't backed up, nor have you provided evidence that causation entails necessary dependence.
It convinces me. It's not a logical fallacy because I'm not saying that I'm certain or that I know this for sure or anything like that. I'm just saying that I am convinced on the weight of the current evidence in neuroscience that our minds are dependent on our physical brains. And That's what the evidence supports. That's what the science supports. That's what the neuroscience shows. And if you disagree with that, that's fine. But I would have to argue that that's counter to the available evidence that we have in neuroscience. And I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm just a layperson.
Right. So that's my point here is that does not entail dependence. That's just your either presupposition or assumption that you want to go to, but that's not entailed, nor is it provided or supported by what you stated. Showing that there's a cause. So, for example, I can show that if I change the tuning on my guitar, it changes the way the notes are played. So there's a causation relationship there, but I can also play that same note on a different guitar, a different piano, or I can hear the note in my head. I can actually hear it, recall that in my mind, which is not something physical. So just because there's a causation doesn't entail necessarily dependence, and saying you're convinced of it doesn't convince me, nor is that evidence that that's the case.
No, it's not my job to convince you. My whole point is that I disagree with you that the mind is something that is independent of the brain, that there's some, I guess, is some soul that keeps the brain being what it is, because let's say my soul is an atheist.
Can I interject?
Yeah, go ahead.
I interject to say that that's not what I argued. I didn't argue that the soul is independent of the brain.
Okay. So
I just said that
I'm not sure what your point was then.
But they're not. Well, as I repeated in my opening, that it's neither identical nor reducible to the brain.
I don't know that I would agree with that either, but do you not agree that the soul is independent of the brain?
Not while in body, no. I believe that when you're, it's so if I could go back to my illustration about, let's say, the piano.
Okay.
As long as I have a piano to play, my ability to play music is going to be dependent on having the piano, and you affect the piano, you're going to affect the way my music's played.
Sure.
But I didn't touch on the dependence issue. Perhaps you might ask if I think can the soul exist without a body and brain? I would say yes, but I'd also say that wasn't in any relevance or part of my argument. My argument was that if there is no God, consciousness would not exist, given that consciousness is not physical.
Yeah, I think that's just a bald assertion that you haven't demonstrated.
I gave arguments for it.
I know you gave arguments, but you didn't demonstrate it. That's my point. That's why I disagree with it.
Oh, the demonstration, right? Okay. So let's go back to the. Let me ask you, I guess. Well, if you disagree with it, because I'm guessing you think that the brain can produce the mind.
I think that the mind is an emergent property of the brain activity. Yes, that's what the science shows.
Oh, it doesn't. You can't keep asserting that that's what the science shows. It doesn't show that. The science doesn't show anything metaphysical. The science doesn't show anything about consciousness. You have to presuppose using metaphysics.
No. The mind is not metaphysical. The fact that we are conscious is not metaphysical. What you can say is that the way we think is metaphysical, perhaps, but consciousness itself is not a metaphysical property. It's
consciousness.
It's a physical thing. It takes place in my brain.
Okay, so then when you consciously think of a pink elephant, that is in your brain.
The abstraction. Now you're going to the abstraction. Now you're going from the conscious, which is part of the physical. It's dependent on the physical, to the abstract.
No, because you're saying it's so. I guess you're saying consciousness is an abstract. An abstract to what? In other words, who has experienced consciousness?
No.
Is it you or your brain, or are you saying you are your brain?
Okay, hang on. I didn't say consciousness was an abstract. I'm saying the things that consciousness derive, like me thinking of a pink elephant, is an abstraction. But consciousness itself it takes place in a physical brain. It is itself, to the extent that we can demonstrate it, demonstrable. And I also would think that Daniel Dennett would disagree that consciousness even exists in the same sense, because it's, I think the critic said consciousness explained away or something like that.
Yeah, that was John Sorrow, who's also an atheist, who disagreed with him. But when I quoted atheists earlier, you said you're not debating them, but you went back to quote Daniel Dennett. I'm not debating Daniel Dennett, right?
Well, no, I'm debating him because he talks about consciousness, and that's what we're talking about. And I'm not a neuroscientist, and he is closer to that information than I am. But my point is that if you're going to try to saddle me with things that atheists say, at least let me be the one that says it, not you. Like, I wouldn't saddle you with something that William Lane Craig said.
Well, no. Well, my point. I wasn't.
Okay.
I don't think I was saddling you, and forgive me if that's how it came across. My point was, you said earlier you're going to look at peer-reviewed stuff. And then you even mentioned Dennett. Well, I said, well, there are people who also produce peer-reviewed stuff who are also atheists, not Christians, so you can't say they have a Christian bias. I disagree with people like Dennett. So in other words, my point was that what you're saying doesn't support or detract from my claim, because I can just kind of pull the same thing. Then we're just kind of saying, well, let's look at peer review. So it takes more than peer review. It takes philosophy. It takes logical deductions. It takes looking at what the evidence does show and point to. And I would say it takes medical reflection. You're the one that said that's the best way to come to knowledge or truth.
There are peer-reviewed articles that discuss the mind being an emergent property of the brain that are from like medical sources. This isn't just me pulling it out my butt. I'm telling you, this is from doctors and medical sources. Well, you can go to like you can go to like what is it, NCIA or NIH.gov. They have all kinds of articles on this. I've actually looked at a couple of them. And what's the other one? Let me look it up real quick. PubMed.
Well, but what I'm saying, I've done these things. I've looked into these things. So,
okay.
In other words, what I'm essentially saying is you can't just as if point to someone who's written a peer-reviewed article and as if that somehow disproves my case or provides
I'm not saying it necessarily disproves it. I'm not saying it necessarily disproves it. I'm saying it provides a foundation for why I would disagree with your assertion.
And I did the same thing. So then we're back to just disagreeing, which is why I'm saying this takes philosophical metaphysical.
But what are you disagreeing based on? What is your disagreement based on? Is it based on peer review?
Law of identity would be one thing, and law of identity would be one thing, and so you're going back to the peer review thing. So law of identity would be one thing. Let me put it this way, and if how do you know or identify that you're in pain?
How do I identify that I'm in pain? That's a great question. I feel something. My brain tells me that I'm feeling something. This doesn't feel pleasant. It feels what we would describe as painful. That's the best word we have for it. I would say that my brain is telling me that it hurts. And the brain can lie about that, by the way.
Well, that's
we can induce pain in people that have nothing physical wrong with them just by messing with their brain.
Which goes to the question of what is pain, because whether there's something physical wrong with them or not, they're still feeling pain, right?
Yeah,
it's interesting, and I don't want to be.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, me too. I would too. So it's interesting. So there could be nothing physically wrong with someone, and yet still have the mental state of feeling pain. So it shows that that it's not the same thing as just the brain. It's not something.
No. Now we're off way off of left field, because that's not anywhere near what I was getting at. But what I'm saying is that my mental state of feeling pain, even if nothing is physically wrong with me, is still a product of the current structure of my brain. If we alter that structure, if I, for example, take narcotics, opiates, I can remove that pain. And I've altered my brain physically to do that. One follows from the other.
I agree that there's a cause and effect relationship.
Sure.
So do you?
I'm not saying that you have to. I'm not saying that I have to like have my arm hacked off to feel pain. That wasn't the point.
No, and that's not what I was saying either. My point is that pain is a mental state, which, like you said, then I guess you would disagree that mental states and brain states are different. And what I'm saying is, by different, I'm going to go as far as to say, let me just put it this way: mental states, can't describe a mental state in terms of anything physical. I would say this goes to demonstrate that consciousness is not something physical. Even if you say it can be caused or affected by the physical, it doesn't demonstrate that it's identical or reducible to the physical. So now you have something that's non-physical that exists that you're going to have to account for, which I would argue is not something that can be accounted for if there is no God.
Yeah, I don't know how God accounts for it, but I would say that even if I agreed with you, which for the sake of argument I will, let's say that there is something non-physical happening, I would say that that is conceptual, that is abstract in my brain. It is a emergent property. It's something that happens as a result of the physical. And I don't see how that requires a God. I don't see where the God comes into that.
So my argument wasn't that. That was my argument. If there is no God, these things can't happen. Wherever that leads from there is, in a sense, not. It's not part of the argument as a whole, as in and of itself. It's simply saying if there is no God, you're not going to get these things. Now, given the position that that we're talking about, that it is something different, you say for the sake of argument, you would agree. Then I suppose. Then you're saying it's emergent, which I'm going to, just because there's a cause and effect doesn't mean it's emergent, but I'll set that aside and say, well, then we can go into something next, like saying, okay, let's say something like free will.
Sure. Yeah, let's move on from this for a little bit.
I think you've said that. So I think you said that you would reject free will. I would say if there's nothing like a soul, then you can't even in principle have free will, which means you can't have rational responsibility. So I guess here's a question that came to mind. Do you believe that you freely came to be an atheist?
No. To the extent that I freely decided it, I'm convinced that it was probably deterministic on some level, or decided subconsciously or without any conscious thought on my end. I think it was a result of the sensory input of information that I received. And I don't think that I chose it. I don't think that I freely decided it at all, in any sense. Even if I have free will, I still don't think I freely decided it, because I think that that's me not being convinced it's flip it on its head is the same as being convinced, just in reverse. So I'm convinced that something is true, or I become unconvinced that something is true, and it results from the same process, which is sensory input, information.
But by convinced, you mean you were causally determined to by brain states, right?
Sure. So, like for example, I'll make it really easy for me, at least. So let's say that at one point I believed there was a God. I was convinced there was a God in my life. I believed that. I was convinced of it. I don't think I chose to believe that. And then when I was presented with arguments that countered my belief, I eventually stopped believing. And I don't think that I chose to do that either. So even with free will, I don't think I chose to do it. I don't think I have free will, but even with it, I wouldn't have chosen it.
Nevertheless, though, but the answer to the question is still right. So you weren't free. So then by default, you have to concede that either all your beliefs, or at least this belief, is an all rational belief. It's not something that is necessarily based on rationality. It's something that's based on chemical reactions that you were causally determined to believe, and you could not have believed otherwise. Is that right?
I'm thinking about it. Hang on. My chemical reactions are thinking about it. So I would have to say, I think I'm mostly in agreement with what you just said. Yes, I don't think that I chose to do it. I think that my chemical reactions did it. Yes, but I do think that chemical reactions can be rational. Rational just means rational just means consistent with logic and consistent with reality. In other words, reason, basically. That which is reasoned is rational. That which is based on reason, right? So even
I don't think I'd agree there.
Okay, all right, you don't agree. All right, that was part of my opening. I don't know if we want to go over that again, but.
In other words, that may be necessary conditions for rationality, but those aren't sufficient conditions for rationality. In other words, you're going to need more than what you articulated. I think rationality necessarily requires some type of consciousness. You
don't think rationality requires some kind of consciousness? Is that what you just said? Sorry.
I think rationality would also require consciousness, because I don't think it would.
You think it would require
consciousness? Yeah.
I think I would agree with that. Yes, I think, or something quasi-conscious too. I think perhaps an AI could form rational thoughts too at some point, and it's not necessarily conscious to the same level that we are. Perhaps. I don't know enough about AI though. I work for an AI company though.
Well, oh, nice. Well, I disagree, but let's go back to the free will issue though. So, if you don't have free will, then I think you did already concede that. Then your beliefs are causally determined by irrational processes. Because if I have a thought that all A's are B's, all B's are C's, I can conclude that therefore all A's are C's, right? You kind of said that earlier with the X, Y, and Z. Is that right?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So we know that. So then we can say that beliefs and thoughts have a necessary, just a contingent, but a necessary logical relation. However, when you look at the states of the brain, when I have the thought all A's are B's, there's a certain group of neurons that fire. And when I think all B's are C's, another set of neuron fires. Then when I think, therefore, all A's are C's, another set of neuron fires. That my beliefs have a necessary logical entailment, but it makes no sense to look at the brain, say that this brain state necessarily logically entails another brain state. Which would again show it's not reducible and it's not identical.
Sorry.
And that, so in other words, neurons firing don't logically entail anything. You don't logically entail neurons firing, therefore other neurons fire. So I would say that
it's a non sequitur.
If you're going to point to the brain as a quote rational process, if you're going to point to the brain as a non-rational process, I mean, as the neurons firing, then I'm demonstrating logically that this is not a quote rational process. It's just a physical operation going on. It's not a quote rational process. I'm sure you've heard the debate with Dillahunty and I forgot who else it was, where the guy says if I shake a bottle of Coke and open it, these chemicals fizzing aren't quote rational processes.
Yeah, that's a logical fallacy. That is a logical fallacy. It is a false equivalency. He is comparing two things that aren't anywhere near each other. The fact that wow, how do I put this? The fact that H2O or CO2 fizzing out of a can can't do rational processes doesn't mean that something more complex can't. That is
no. In other words,
that is a logical fallacy.
Well, show me how it can.
You're arguing.
I mean, how a because wheels turning, wheels and gears turning aren't a rational process.
My brain isn't wheels and gears turning.
Doesn't make it rational.
The computer isn't a brain.
To finish my thought there. In other words, you're essentially going to be putting physical things together to form a brain, right? Which,
yes.
Or you can look at wheels turning and say that's not rational, and then put other pieces of matter and then make it more complicated pieces of matter. So you're basically saying at some point you're going to get physical pieces of matter, rearrange them in the right place, put a right structure to it, and then somehow consciousness comes into existence and rationality.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I think you're making a fallacy of arguing from the specific to the general, which is just it's false. You can't do that. It's irrational.
That's not a fallacy.
That is a fallacy.
Yes. I mean, because so here's what you're trying to say, I think, is so there are fallacies, and I forget the exact words for them. If I say all red bricks weigh 1 pound, therefore a house of red bricks weigh 1 pound, yes, that's a fallacy. I forget the technical term, but it's not a fallacy to say all red bricks are red and a house of red bricks are still red. So in some instances, it can be a fallacy, but just to label what I said as a fallacy and move on from that doesn't demonstrate it's a fallacy. It just demonstrates what you think I'm saying, but you have to provide evidence. Okay.
I was going to. So it is a fallacy of arguing from the specific to the general. You are doing that. You are saying that this specific thing can't do reason, therefore this other not same thing that is also physical can't do reason, and that is arguing from the specific to the general, and I reject that. So let me clarify. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that fallacy means that you might be wrong, that you cannot determine whether or not you're correct based on that.
Is it a fallacy to say red brick is red, therefore a house of red bricks is red? Is that a fallacy?
45 minutes is done. So, but you guys can go on. I'm still waiting for questions.
Did we finish 45 minutes already?
Yeah, maybe at
that went by quick.
10 minutes.
Okay.
So
it would still be. It would still be a fallacy. The difference is that one of them is demonstrable in reality. We could look at the red brick and look at the big red house and determine that the red brick and the red house are distinct, that the red brick does result in the red house. But the thing is that the structure is still logically fallacious. So the point is that you can have an argument that is, yes, it is. You can have an argument where the content is correct, but the structure is flawed.
So you're telling me that logical fallacies can lead to truth?
No, I'm telling you that logical fallacies don't tell you whether or not the conclusion is true. You cannot determine it from that.
So,
I'm telling you that if okay, let me try to correct myself here a little bit. So, or maybe paint it a little differently. So, if you have a logical fallacy, the argument's conclusion could still be true, and we could demonstrate the argument's conclusion is true outside of the argument. The example that I gave was all planets are made of iron, all items made of iron are wormholes, therefore all planets are wormholes. If in fact all planets were wormholes, even if the argument was flawed, which that one isn't, but if it were, we would be able to demonstrate that in reality, and it would just mean that we have a fallacious argument and that we need to formulate some other argument that demonstrates this correctly.
So I don't think it's a fallacy, but we can
Okay.
move on from there. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. So I get, but you did say, so you said one is demonstrable. So are you saying you can demonstrate that when you do rearrange physical matter to a certain point and give it a certain structure, that it will bring about consciousness?
I'm sorry, can you ask that one more time?
So are you implying, because you said one is demonstrable. When I mentioned the red brick illustration, you said that's demonstrable.
Yes.
Are you saying you can demonstrate that rearranging physical matter and giving it a different structure and adding or taking away more parts is going to bring about consciousness?
I think we can demonstrate that, but that wasn't what I was saying there. What I was saying, my whole point was that...
How would you demonstrate?
My whole point was that no matter what structure you use for that, or what you plug into XYZ or whatever, or PQR, it doesn't matter. That structure of this individual smaller component is X, therefore the larger component is also X or whatever. That is a argument from the specific to the general, and that is fallacious no matter what you plug into it. The conclusion could still be true even if the argument is fallacious.
I mean,
That's just.
I disagree.
Okay.
Because I could just give more examples, but you'd probably have the same response. So I don't know how we're doing on time. We didn't touch
I could give you one example that's really obvious.
Argument against centralism.
I can give you a really obvious
I know
example.
of examples that show, in other words, that type of reasoning can be fallacious, but I think it's a case by case. I don't think you can bring. I think you're arguing from a specific to a general, because you can show a specific example demonstrates a fallacy. Therefore, all examples demonstrate a fallacy. So you just committed the very fallacy you accused me of committing, which is kind of ironic.
No, I didn't. So, I either have an apple in my hand or an orange. I don't have an orange, therefore I have an apple. That is fallacious argument. That is a fallacious argument, but I'm still holding an apple. I could also have been holding grapes or a banana. Yes, it is.
That's okay. No, it would be a false premise, but it's not a fallacious argument. That's actually one of the rules of logic, which you alluded to in the beginning. There are certain rules of logic, and especially propositional logic.
Sorry,
that is an either or. And that is,
that's my fault. That was a bad example. I'll try to give you another one if you want. But the point is, even with false premises, I think you were correct. Yes, I think I made a mistake there. My point that I was getting at in that case would be that even false premises. No, it's fine. Is that even false premises could still have a true conclusion? In this case, I'm still holding an apple. So even though the premise is false, it's still true. So there could still be a logically fallacious structure. I may not be able to think one off the top of my head that would do the same thing.
I agree that an argument can be, in other words, won't be sound, and yeah, we would agree on that. How are we doing on time, Zuriel?
Yeah, real quick, update us.
We only have 2 minutes and it's pretty open discussion.
Until we go to Q&A, is that what you're saying?
Do we have any Q&A?
Before we go to
okay.
If not, we can just keep going because I'm having fun. So,
do we have questions?
I have more questions, but
we have questions. All right. I think let's try to answer this question because you've been.
Well, before we
you've
go
been
there,
going circles.
if we got
If we want to
2
wrap
minutes,
up a little bit.
We can go
I'm
question
okay
and
with.
then wrap up.
Well, I mean, we can just wrap up what we're
we do
talking
have 2
about.
minutes, I wanted to.
Go on.
I wanted to ask about the evolutionary argument against naturalism. How do you avoid the undercutting defeater? Given your brain is not a mechanism designed to obtain truth, and you have an undercutting defeater that all your beliefs are not necessarily aimed toward truth value, but survival value, how do you avoid that?
How do I avoid what?
Undercutting defeater.
What undercutting defeater? I don't. I mean, I heard you say it in your opening. I even wrote it down, and I still don't know what you mean by that. I'm sorry. I'm not being obtuse or anything. I really didn't understand you.
That's fine, especially if you're not familiar with Are you familiar with Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism?
I don't think so, but I'm also not a philosophical naturalist.
It's not against philosophical naturalism.
Okay,
It's
fair enough.
just against the. It's and the way I'll put it this way, because to be fair, in the way I presented it, it's if there's no God, this would follow. Now, I know you don't take a position on that. I know you just say, I like belief in God, and that's fine. But that wouldn't affect the argument that if there was no God, this would follow. And if you can have knowledge and rationality, and if you can have rationality and knowledge, then the position there is no God would have to be false. Because if all you have is a natural celeste, the argument I gave, every belief your brain produces carries with it an undercutting defeater, given that there's no design for truth. I like to put it this way: your brain is a glorified magical 8-ball if God does not exist. The only difference between an 8-ball and a brain is that at least the 8-ball was designed, whereas the brain wasn't.
Okay, that I don't see how any of that's demonstrated, and to me, it's again just arguing from the specific to the general. But also, I would argue that what you're doing there is saying that the brain can't be rational, that it necessarily. Okay, so what are you saying? Maybe I misunderstood.
Well,
you're nodding no. So.
Right, and I'm trying to be fair here. So
no, it's fine.
What I'm saying is that you're not that it necessarily. In other words, that by default, it's not going to be something that is aimed for rationality or truth. It's just going to be, if your mind is you should, because it's going to determine whether or not you can have a justified belief.
I don't go for truth. I don't think I can have truth. I'm not convinced that I can have anything akin to what you probably think truth is. I am convinced that the most I can have is inferences.
Take that to be true, right?
Yes. To the extent that I can know anything to be true, I do take that to be true. But I don't think that that's truth. I don't think that's... Because to me, truth is about reality. And inferences are not reality. And what I just described to you is something else completely. It's philosophical versus... that's abstract versus reality. Which is something different. It's a category error.
Yeah, I know, but everything you just said is not your definition of reality, yet you would still take that to be true. So it's a contradiction of what you just said.
No, because I'm not saying I would take it as truth. I'm saying that I would believe that it is probably true. To the extent that I can. Truth would be that which comports with reality, and I don't know that we can assess reality completely to get to something truth. Some kind of truth. I think that we can get close to truth to the extent that we can, but I can't prove that I'm not a brain in a vat or living in the Matrix. So there is the problem of hard solipsism. But there is the problem of hard solipsism, which there isn't a solution to.
I don't think it's a problem. And you sound a lot like Dillahunty, which is not a bad thing. I like the guy, and we've become friends over the past few years. I'm sorry, Zuriel, go ahead.
As much as we want to continue this, I think we're past the
running short on
time limit.
Okay.
Even the grace time, yeah. So
I am gonna run to the bathroom while you look at the questions, if that's okay.
It's okay.
Right back.
Right.
Look at my PJs.
I'm wearing shorts.
Second. I'll go by the first question. This is for Eric. I think you can hear me because he has a wireless headset. Eric, if you can hear me, the question for you is, maybe I'll just tell you when you come back.
Yeah, we could take a moment while we wait.
So it's from John Rafael Mario Magbuhos. He's from the Patas Forum too. He's been here, he's debated here for like 2 times. Right, so Eric, the question is for you. The question is, Eric, how would you differentiate if an assertion exists in fantasy and in reality don't apply empirical evidence?
Okay. So basically, how do I know if something is true, whether or not if I don't have empirical evidence? I'd say because again, it's a self-defeating view. In other words, if the person asking the question believes, in order to know something's true, you have to have empirical evidence. Then I would ask for empirical evidence for the belief that in order to know something's true, you need empirical evidence. What empirical evidence can you give to show empirical evidence is true? You write the word empirical evidence on a piece of paper, burn it, put it in some water, turn it around, and if it turns blue, it's true. It's a very belief and position is a philosophical position that is not an empirical position. So the very belief of empiricism is a philosophical way of epistemology. It's not a scientific epistemology. It's philosophical. So to ask the very question is to prove itself wrong. It's self-defeating.
Right. So this is for Benjamin. I don't think it's quite related to the topic, but it's more of a personal view. And the question from Jihan Max is from the Christian think tank where I belong, represent. All right. To Sir Benjamin, what would convince you that God exists, or to lean to theism?
What would convince me that God exists?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, wow. All right. Real? All right. Okay, I'll take that. Okay, here's a question from JC. I think I saw him from Patas Forum too. JC, question for both. Here's the question. Question for both. If our science can examine a supernatural phenomenon, did science become a supernatural tool? Or did the supernatural become natural? Let me repeat it. If our science can examine a supernatural phenomenon, did science become a supernatural tool? Or did the supernatural become natural? I think you could answer that first. Benjamin, what do you think?
Sure, I would probably say that supernatural is the bucket label to which we drop things that we can't assess in the natural world. At least that seems to be what most apologists or people who believe in God use it as. I don't want to paint everybody that way, but that's the general definition that I would go with. And so for me, once we take something out of that bucket and can demonstrate it in reality, it's no longer supernatural, it's now natural. I think is that kind of where the question was going? I think if we can say about it, Eric? If we could examine the supernatural, then it becomes natural, right?
It cut out a little bit there, but I think the question is in some sense based on a logical fallacy, but I understand what they're trying to ask. I guess a better way to put it was, if we think something is supernatural, but the thing in question can be detected scientifically, then what would happen is that it turns out that what we thought was actually false. It wasn't supernatural. So if I believe something is supernatural, but I am able to detect it, then it's just a case that, oh, it turns out I was wrong. It actually is natural. The reason being is because science is a wonderful discipline that can study the natural world, but by default cannot detect the supernatural. So to try and use science to investigate something supernatural would be like trying to find plastic with a metal detector. It's simply a category fallacy. So in principle, you can't detect something that is non-physical scientifically. And that's how I would answer the question that way. And which is why when we're talking about God of the soul, we're not talking science, we're talking metaphysics. Now, if someone wants to reject metaphysics, that's an entirely different discussion and question. I think virtually all of science itself is based on metaphysical categories.
Holy crap!
In other words, I think science presupposes philosophy, and that's something that you can find in that's something you can find in peer-reviewed journals everywhere. Awesome, just agreement. That's good.
All right. Okay. So next would be. I'm sorry. Second,
You look though. I'm curious, real quick. If you agreed with that, then why did you say that what I said needed to be demonstrated empirically? If you already agreed that by default you can't detect something like a soul or God, any empirical scientific investigation, why would you ask for that then?
Because my point would be, if you can't demonstrate it, then it's not believable, and by default, I don't believe it if you can't demonstrate it. If I'm asking you to demonstrate it, it's your responsibility to do that. If you're telling me that it's real, I'm going to ask for a demonstration. Whether or not you can provide that, it's not my problem. That's your problem.
Isn't it not the case that if you ask, if your position is based on the belief that everything must be demonstrated, then wouldn't then the burden of proof be on you to demonstrate to me that everything requires a demonstration?
I could demonstrate the reliability of relying on demonstrations. I can't demonstrate that empiricism is true empirically, but I can demonstrate the reliability of relying on empiricism. And the proof of that would be the fact that we're having a conversation over the internet.
Which would prove that empiricism is false, because if your position is based on empirical evidence and you just conceded to me that you cannot give me empirical evidence for the foundation of your position, then you cannot believe your own position.
That's because I presuppose it. I don't need to demonstrate that. If I presuppose it, I don't have to demonstrate it, but I do have to demonstrate the reliability of it, which I do.
All right. Okay. Here. The next question is another question from JC. How do we detect that a person is conscious without any physical manifestations or tools? How can you know that a person lying on the ground, eyes closed, is conscious without looking at his body or any apparatus? Because I can't wrap my head around consciousness being independent from the physical. I think that's for Erick.
Yeah, so this is kind of something that I was trying to touch on, and it's if someone's not, and this is nothing against Benjamin at all, so I hope he didn't take it this way, but if someone's not familiar with the field, then it does become a little difficult to kind of have to work through some of the layers to get to some arguments or points. But one of the things I was trying to get at was that consciousness is not something you can detect. It's a first person introspective kind of thing. In other words, a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he can never know more about my thought life than I do, because you cannot detect consciousness by looking from a third person empirical perspective. You cannot open up my brain and see what I'm thinking. To know what I'm thinking, you have to ask me. So I think that would further provide evidence that consciousness is not something physical, nor is it something that can be, quote, found in the brain. If you could find it in the brain, then crack my skull open and you could see it. You can't, because it's not something, quote, in the brain.
I was going to respond, but I'll continue.
Okay.
We agreed on most of that right up to the end. Well, I was just going to say, I guess then it's still taking place within the confines of this physical medium. Everything else we agreed on. I don't know that how you can possibly say that it requires something not within that physical medium. That would be my only objection to that.
I guess I'd have to ask you to demonstrate how you know it's in the medium. How would you detect that it's in the medium? If all you see is neurons firing, that doesn't prove therefore that's conscious. You're just...
No, I agree. I would have to appeal back to the neuroscience of split brain patients and all that, and what we can do to alter brain states. But I can't prove other people are conscious. You could just be a robotic machine that I'm the only conscious being in the world. I have no idea. I can't prove it. I believe that you are, because it's practical to do so, but I don't know that for certain or anything like that. Anyway.
Great.
Here's another question from Mark.
Clarify.
Yeah,
I agree with your position of what you said. Not that I agree that's the case, but yeah, you're
I know
being
what you
consistent there. I'll give you that. You're being consistent.
so here, from Mark Naldo. Another question for Sir Erick. Currently, we're applying methodological naturalism as the only method to discern reality, assuming there is. It doesn't mean that we are concluding it's the only method we have to access knowledge. What kind of method or process could you do to conclude that God really is the anchor for logic and reason? And why should we accept that method or process as reliable?
What was the last part of the question? I think the first part was rejecting methodological naturalism as the only way to come to knowledge. And the second part was what?
What kind of method or process did you do to conclude that God is the anchor for logic and reason? And why should we accept your method or process as reliable?
The method and process I used was logic and reason, because I think everything is going to be a branch of philosophy. Logic and reason is literally a philosophical enterprise, not a scientific enterprise. It is a philosophical enterprise that is implemented in science. It's not a philosophical thing. Math itself is a branch of logic. So science is a slave to philosophy. You cannot do adequate science without doing adequate philosophy. And if anyone says no, they're giving me a philosophical objection to the very claim that you need philosophy to do science. So even that, an objection is self-defeating. So I would say that's the method that I would use, is logic and reason, because that's what's going to underpin any and everything you do, because these are things that even are going to be a priori truths, not a posteriori truth, which Benjamin said he just presupposes, which in a sense is a philosophical position to take prior to doing science.
That I would agree with.
Here's the question. Here's the question for Sir Benjamin. It's from Kamatis Analysis Unit. They're really familiar with Filipino apologists. This would be like the counterpart of David Wood, Filipino version. That I would say, right here. Expounding on Sir Erick's question, if what you said is true, that you are not aiming for truth, it seems that you are only adhering to this true enough frameworks and inferences like it's probably true, the exists evidence supports this, and etc. Then my question is, what else is the value of those inferences and those frameworks aside from survival? And here's a follow-up question: If it's only for survival, don't you think that you should be more focusing more only on moral truth enough?
I think that's
true enough.
I think that's a genetic fallacy. I think the question is based on a genetic fallacy, which is it's similar to like let's see, how can I put it? My nose has a purpose. It's of being able to smell things, but I can also use it to breathe, or I can stick stuff up in it. There's no intrinsic purpose behind anything. So the fact that inferences are used for survival, while that is true, it doesn't mean that inferences can only be used for survival. That to me is a logical fallacy that doesn't follow. I can use my liver as a way to filter my own toxins in my body, but I can also donate the liver to somebody else, and that's not anything intrinsic to the liver. So the point is that what something is in physically or what it evolved to be is irrelevant to how I choose to use it in my real life. So for me, the value of inferences isn't just about survival. I would prefer to also thrive. So I want to live the maximal positive life that I can. I want to experience pleasure, happiness, enjoyment. I want to spend time with people that I like. I want to eat foods that I enjoy to the extent that it doesn't harm me physically to become too fat, but too much cheesecake. So anyway, the point is that I don't agree with the question. I think it's a fallacious question.
So I think
Can I touch on that?
Yeah, let Erick hit it.
So it seems like the questioner was alluding to my first argument, which we didn't really have time to get to.
Yeah.
But he also made, in his question was also interesting because he did talk about, in the beginning, you said that you wanted to believe as many true things as possible and not believe as many false things as possible. Yet you also, it seemed to say in our debate that you don't think we can actually get to truth. So it seems like your entire goal is not even possible in your very position, that you don't even know if there is truth or you can get to truth. Yet that's your enterprise. And what I saw that he added on there was, on my argument, was that given that your brain is not a mechanism designed to obtain truth, which gives it an undercut and defeater, I don't want to go through the argument, but it's like saying, if you're not going to believe what a magic 8-ball says, why rely on what your brain says? Because your brain's not aiming for truth. It's just aiming for adaptive survival behavior, beliefs that grant that. In other words, your beliefs don't have to be true for them to work. And that's what your brain is aiming at. It's a pragmatic thing that's not aimed at truth.
Yeah, may I comment just briefly, because I think you were talking about something I think or said. So when it comes to believing as many true things as few false things as possible, I'm saying true to the extent that we can assess it. I'm not saying truth. I'm not saying I want to believe truth because I don't think we can get to truth. I think there's a distinction between as true as possible and truth, and I think you would agree with that. And I think the question would agree with it too.
Yeah, and I guess if I push back, we're just going to go into
No, that's fine. We could always have a part two, like I said before. I'd be happy to do a part two. And maybe we could talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, I think that would be the last question, and it's...
we're done. Okay. That was it.
On the 1 hour and 46 minute count. So we could address what could have been better. All right, so it's the closing statement. I think we will just need around 5 minutes or so. A brief closing statement could have been better, and what's a better topic for the next debates, if there will be possible debates.
Sure.
All right, so you go first, Erick. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah. So I don't think I'll take 5 minutes, but the topic of the debate is belief in God supported by reason. I gave 3 arguments why not only it is, which was the first one, but that if there is no God, then you can't have, not only would you not have rationality, you wouldn't have free will, nor the consciousness to even have free will or rationality in the first place. In a debate, I'm going to say that you're going to have to either defend why you believe it is a case or show why you believe it is not the case. I think Benjamin should have provided a case why it's not the case, but it seemed like what he did was show how logic and reason works, which I agree with, but then also seemed to contradict himself in areas that we talked about. I won't go back over that. But in other words, I never heard a reason why belief in God is not supported by reason. What I heard was people make logical fallacies and I can't trust it. I agree with that. But I wasn't looking for, not convinced. I'm looking for, logically speaking, based on reasons, here's why this can't be the case. And here's why I believe that belief in God is not supported by reason. I didn't hear that, which means technically he never answered the question. So it still remains the case. Belief in God, in fact, can be supported by reasons. It might just be that some of those reasons are bad. That doesn't even mean that there are no reasons. It just means that there might be reasons that maybe Benjamin hasn't looked into, which he might even agree with that. But in principle, there is nothing to show, and nothing I've heard today, that belief in God cannot be supported by reason. And that was the topic of the debate, whether it can or can't. I said it can. You think he wanted to imply he can't, but that it can't. But I didn't hear an argument or see evidence, much less empirical evidence, for why belief in God cannot be supported by reason.
All right. Okay. So, Benjamin.
Sorry, my mic was muted. All right. Yeah, thanks. Real quick, Eric, I wanted to just say thanks before we close out for coming to this. This was fun. I had a good time. And we didn't even get heated. It was awesome. So I would just close out by saying, I would just close out by saying, when he says that belief in God is supported by reason, I gave my definition of reason in the opening, and reason to me is it requires empirical evidence, and I don't think Eric presented any empirical evidence here today, which leads me to continue not believing. I don't have to provide empirical evidence that there is no God or that anything like that. All I'm trying to do is address these claims that Eric is asserting as positive claims to knowledge, which I reject them. And to say that I must provide evidence to the contrary is a shifting of the burden of proof, and I reject it. And I think that tonight it showed that Eric isn't able to present actual empirical evidence. Now, I would actually agree that perhaps there is empirical evidence that he could have presented or didn't, or somebody else has some, but I have never seen it, and so I remain unconvinced. I'm done. It was short. I didn't want to take up too much time in my closing.
I really appreciate you guys. It's the first time here in Diskurso Pinas that we hosted a debate for foreigners, for Americans. And it's
I live in the Philippines.
Fruitful that we get to... Yeah, that's what I say. It's technically a Filipino. So it's very fruitful that, I never had the headache that I usually have when Filipinos debate. They don't have sometimes they don't have these kinds of respect for each other. Not all, but there are some. So I hope Filipino debaters can at least learn from what you guys did today, and I hope this will be the last time that we would do this. And for again, thank you very much, Benjamin and Eric, for being here tonight with me and for doing it free. If they did it free.
Wait, what?
So, oh, no.
I don't know. What are we doing?
Okay, so and thank you very much for those who sent questions and interacted with us. Again, you can access Erick's social media accounts. He has a Facebook account, Erick Hernandez XB, and a YouTube account. He has an upcoming debate, right? The Aaron Ra?
Yeah, my next debate, I'm debating Arn Ra on the Soul.
He's angry.
And after that, I'll...
I'm joking. He's a nice guy, but he is a firebrand. I'll give you that.
Have you seen the video of my interaction with him?
I don't think so. I might have to look at it. I might have to check that out.
I'll have to send it to you, because angry would be an understatement. He got angry because I asked him a question. But yeah, I'll be debating him on the Soul on the Gospel Truth channel, maybe in like a few weeks. And then after that, I'll be doing another debate, also I think on the Soul, with a non-believer from California. And then that's so far, those are the two that I have set. There might be a few other ones coming up, but yeah, and I'll post them on my channel. You can watch them live on the channel that's going to be streaming on, but I'll also post it on mine, kind of like what I'll do with this one.
And how about you, Benjamin?
Yeah, I showed Eric my gaming page, and he came in, and we had some fun watching me get chased by killers, and that was really fun. That's bit.ly/PoggyFB if you're interested. And I would say that I think Eric is a really fun guy to talk to. I don't think that we had any disagreements that were angry or heated or anything like that. I think we just had a nice civil intellectual discussion, and I'd like to do more of that. And I think that there's some things that I need to go back and watch and think about what we talked about, and maybe see how I could have responded better to some of it. This is only my second time doing a real live debate, and so I appreciate having the opportunity to do it. And I do hope that we can do this some more, because I really enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to doing quite a bit more of this, but I don't have anything else lined up in terms of debates, but I do have the weekly show that we do, Patas Weekly. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about Iglesia ni Cristo, which is it's almost like the local, I guess, the Scientologists equivalent of the Christians here in the Philippines, where they kind of they will try to sue anybody who gets in their way and fight anybody who talks badly about them. So I'm going to talk badly about them tomorrow. So feel free to come check it out. And that was mostly a joke, but yeah. But thank you so much for hosting this, and thank you, Eric, again for coming. And I can't wait to do more. Hopefully.
All right. Okay. That's about it. Again. I remind you guys that be honest in your pursuit of truth, but be biased as much as possible. And if you need help understanding the Christian faith, you can always message Diskurso Pinas or Erick or other people out there. Right. And I hope.
Oh yeah. Follow this page. Make sure you follow Diskurso Pinas, definitely.
All right. Okay. So, and for a last reminder, we might disagree in everything that we
I'll say one more thing too. Is kind of in line with what Benjamin said. Follow this page, but not just follow it. I'm going to encourage anybody listening, consider giving financially to it so that we can have better discussions. Subscribe to Benjamin's channel as well. Just because you don't believe in what he believes in doesn't mean you can't support them and look at some of the content they're showing. If you're a Christian and you are not listening to what atheists are saying, you're not doing your job. You need to go out and expose yourself to other views so that you know first what you believe and have a foundation for what you believe. And I'd say openly, follow truth where it leads. With Diskurso page in particular, I'm going to encourage you to try and support it financially. Let's be honest. You watch these things, but we want to make sure we have good quality, good connection, good stuff going on. That takes money. He's not trying to get rich off this. He's not doing it for money. Myself and Benjamin are doing it for free. So if you like these things to continue,
I made it for the money. I don't know what you're talking about.
Support what.
Amen, Eric. I'm all in agreement with you, and on that. Amen. Follow the evidence where it leads. We're in agreement, and help out people and atheists. If you're not listening to Eric or any other Christians talking, you should, because you need to know what these people are saying to really be able to rebut it. Don't just listen to me. So we're in a complete agreement. It's nice to end on a high.
All right, thank you.
All right.
So yeah. Again and again, we might disagree on major positions in this world, in our lives, but we agree in one thing today. Philippines has a very high cases in COVID, and you must stay your home as much as possible. Always wash your hands, all right? And take care always pray. God bless you guys, and see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Perfect.